webinar sessions on advancing recovery. We're very excited to be able to reach out to all of you. I will just be talking to you a little bit initially about some housekeeping issues. You can be supported in those by Sharon Wright. That's the voice you've been hearing for the last couple minutes. And in a moment, you'll see how you can reach her. And then after those housekeeping issues and some introductory remarks, I will be introducing and turning over this session to Rick Gosha. So Rick, go ahead and take us to the next slide. So in terms of where we are with the webinar, we have everybody on mute, and for those of you that have been part of these kinds of things, that's a good thing. That allows us to prevent noise in the background, and when we get to questions and all, we will have a means of individually unmuting you. But in the meantime, do be sure to mute your own background noise when you're speaking to the broader audience. We will invite participation by submitting questions, and I'm going to show you in a minute how to do that using the web technology. But we will also have opportunities during the session when we'll stop, and you can speak out your questions by letting us know that you have a question. We'll take you off of mute, and then you can go ahead and ask your question. You should have already received materials for today. That is a slide set and 2 handouts. If you did not, you can get them in the handout section of the menu for the GoToWebinar. Also, I want to point out there's a slight difference in the version that was sent to you this morning and the one that's in handouts. The one that is in the handout section and the one that you see on the screen has slide numbers. We realized very late in the game that we had not added those, and so they are now on the version that you're seeing on the screen, and that's available online and certainly available subsequent to this session. We are recording this webinar, so for those of you that are listening in our future, many of the housekeeping items I just covered won't apply to you because they're for the live participants. But many have asked about the ability for team members that are missing this call to listen to this at another time. It will indeed be available. We'll tell a bit more about that at the end. And also at the end, we'll do a brief evaluation so that we get some feedback from you all about this session and the kinds of things that you're most interested in and where you'd like to see this go, etc. So really appreciate your taking some time to give us that. If you're new to using GoToWebinar, here's the control panel. The first thing to know is that in the upper right-hand or left-hand side of your, the right-hand side of your screen, there's the ability to open and close your menu. So you can minimize and maximize, and the version that you see on the screen now is maximized, but obviously you don't always need to have that present. So you can use the orange arrow and open and close that. Audio is pretty important. If you are indeed listening by phone, under audio, the radio next to telephone should be green. If you're listening and going to be speaking through your computer, make sure that that audio button is clicked. And also be sure that you've entered your audio PIN. It allows us to know who's speaking and how to, it connects us with you. So the absence of an audio PIN means it's awfully hard for us to interact with you. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. That's one option, and then you see a little arrow there where you can raise your hand next to your name in the attendee list. You can also type in a question, and that's a great way to go because they accumulate, and we can begin to see the kinds of questions that folks have. And when we pause periodically to process questions, we'll be able to review those and make sure that Rick can answer them. So you can type in questions. And then also just wanted to remind you where the handouts are, just in case you don't have them. So our handouts are also available in the GoToWebinar. And finally, if you are having any technical difficulties, Sharon is available at that email address. That would be for folks right now that are listening by phone but are not seeing the screen and you're struggling getting registered. You can, Sharon is monitoring your email and will support you in gaining access. If you have any other technical difficulties or questions, you can use chat or questions. So a bit about today. This is an overview and an orientation for our series of 6 sessions. And so you're going to hear a lot of today about the topics that we're going to cover in the subsequent sessions. And as in this session and in future, we'll be talking about advancing recovery practices and the strengths model through the lens of actual clients and the people that serve clients. So we'll be starting today with Elizabeth's story, and make the case for why to focus on recovery. And I think many of you that will resonate. We know that there's a lot of commitment to focusing on recovery already. We'll give an overview of the strengths model practices, and then that you'll see once again that Elizabeth's story comes out as a way to demonstrate the strengths model techniques. We'll always be attending to, and will in this case as well, addressing what about organizational alignment with recovery. Recovery doesn't just happen because individual providers embrace it, but organizations need to as well, and there's organizational alignment with recovery that's critical. So that will give you the overview about the webinar series and set the stage as we give you a briefing on what the remaining 5 sessions will cover. And we also have some thoughts for you about how to prepare for next time so that you get the maximum benefit from the future sessions. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that and then do a quick wrap up. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, but we're sure trying to set aside enough time to have questions and hear from you all. Now, it's at this point, a real delight on my part to introduce Rick Gosha. He comes to us from Lawrence, Kansas, where he's the director of the Kansas University Center for Mental Health Research and Innovation. He's well known to many in California, and he's been working with CIBHS and our learning collaboratives for the last 5 or 6 years. But he's also worked with many individual counties and agencies throughout the state, and so many know him and know that he brings a wealth of knowledge and experience. In fact, what's exciting about what Rick's view is that it comes from having been a practicum student, a case manager, virtually every role in the healthcare system and mental health system Rick has filled, and so he really understands the different perspectives, and that informs his approach. You may know his book, which he co-authored with Charles Rapp. Highly recommend it, and it's an ever-evolving story and discussion of the a recovery-oriented approach to mental health services using the strengths model. And one of the things, he's also been teaching internationally, so he brings a lot of California knowledge, Medicaid on a national level knowledge, and even international knowledge in terms of where recovery evolution is happening outside of the borders of the U.S. So we're very excited to have Rick. Rick, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and have you introduce Elizabeth and get us started.
Oh, thanks, Karen. Sorry, I actually was getting fixated on my picture and realizing how much hair I've actually lost over the years. Go back to those days as practicum student and case manager, and I had hair down to my just past my shoulders and stuff. So, wow, I'm really aging. I actually celebrated my 50th birthday yesterday, so I'm trying to decide now whether I'm entering an older age or now I'm a baby of the older age, and so quite a transition for me there. But really excited to be able to do this. I see that there's lots of people out there, and so I'm going to try to imagine as I'm going through this that there's people out there and they're smiling and they're nodding their heads and they're just filled with excitement for this, and that'll make me feel better than imagining that I'm just looking at this screen of myself and everything. For those of you who've seen me before, you're probably used to seeing me flail my arms around and pace, and I would love to be able to actually do that, but sadly enough, I'm kind of constrained to a chair, but I will still hopefully try to bring the same amount of excitement even if I was out dancing around. So, as Karen kind of alluded to, is that we're really going to take this through storylines, and we're going to focus each session through the lens of an actual story in one of the strengths model sites that we've been helping to implement here in Kansas. And each session will feature a different storyline. It'll take different kinds of avenues, people at different stages of their recovery. But rather than just kind of philosophically talking about recovery, we want to kind of help you to see the practice from an up-close view. What do these things actually look like in practice? How does it impact clients? And how do they make shifts over time? And the same thing with workers, people who are, new to the concept of recovery, or people that have kind of been adjusting their practice around the concept of recovery and figure it out. So we want to be able to take this very close view, and then at the same time, we want to be able to back up and look at all the context that surround these stories that really help create this environment where recovery does occur. And so we'll be able to look at this from multiple levels. So bringing you into Elizabeth, hopefully, will be able to make more points than if we just kind of put those things out there. So let's take you back a little bit to Elizabeth, and all the stories that I'll present over this session are ones that I've been involved with on some level, either myself as a worker, from a person who's been doing field mentoring with people who are just learning these practices. It could be around working with people at a larger organizational view. And Elizabeth was a person that I had the pleasure of meeting back in 2010 when we were just starting to implement the strengths model in this one agency that was just starting to really make some big shifts in how they viewed people, what they thought about recovery, what did recovery even mean to them. And Elizabeth didn't know these things were happening, but this is the environment that she started to enter into. So this first view of Elizabeth kind of really looks at who was Elizabeth first viewed at as a person entering the system? She was a 33-year-old white heterosexual woman. She was living at that time with her mother and stepfather, which besides one brief time living on her own, she had lived with her mother in various places across Kansas and even outside of Kansas. She was mostly isolated from the community. She had one friend in another state, but really for most of her life it was kind of contained within her home or the mental health center. She had lots of hospitalizations over her life, and 7 times being hospitalized just in 2009 alone. She was a frequent caller of crisis services. It was a weekly event where she would start to experience suicidal ideation. Things would get very difficult for her, feeling depression, feeling anxiety, etc. She would call up, which sometimes led to the hospitalization, sometimes she ended up at the ER, etc. She had a long history of childhood physical, sexual, emotional abuse. As I mentioned before, she did try to live on her own once, and it lasted 5 months, and you can either view that positively or negatively. For her and her family, it was very much at that time seen as a very negative experience. She finally got this place on her own. Basically, she left the family, just said that she wanted to do this. She eventually went off her medications. She got heavy into drugs and alcohol. She started hearing voices. The depression got very severe. She eventually was evicted from that apartment complex, and she was out on the streets, went to different kinds of places for a while, went into a homeless shelter. Eventually, she was involuntarily hospitalized again, and then to return to living with mom and stepfather upon release. And so this was kind of a period for her of going in the hospital, back to the home, working with mental health, disengaging from mental health, re-engaging. And so in her life, it was kind of this chaotic struggle. It was messy. So now let's fast forward to 2015, actually now going into 2016, and where is Elizabeth now? So where's the end of the story? She's now been living in her own apartment for 5 years. She sings in a church choir. She helps out occasionally at nursery with Sunday school classes. She met a person not too long about moving in who's since become a very close friend who she does things with socially. She got herself a dog, which is a pride and joy and probably one of the greatest things that has actually helped her be able to stay out of the hospital as a support. But things have not always been perfect. I would love to always say that, the light came on, Elizabeth decided to embark on this recovery journey, but it's been a very rocky and sometimes even continues to be a chaotic journey. Definitely not smooth. She's been hospitalized twice in the past 5 years, and actually just not too long ago she had her 3rd hospitalization in the last 5 years as we were putting together this session and presentation. Not too long before Christmas she went back into the hospital, and she's back out, not doing too bad at all. It's nice that she was able to actually go back to her apartment and continue on with the recovery from where she was. She still does call the crisis line. It's a little bit more active. She's usually a little bit more focused about where she's wanting help or what's going on. But she still struggles with depression. She struggles with dissociation. She hears voices. She still has suicidal thoughts, but they're less frequent. They're more recognizable to her. She's not as afraid sometimes now of feeling suicide. And probably one of the most recent things is that she started actually talking about employment. Some say that actually, kind of triggers some of the thoughts about going in the hospital, but she's starting to think and continuing to think about life beyond the mental health system. So for most people, recovery, as it was for Elizabeth, isn't this aha awakening moment, where the light goes on and then people just magically start making progress. That what we typically see is that there's shifts that occur, shifts in people's narratives, how they view themselves, and those things shift over time, sometimes quickly, sometimes slow. There's shifts that occur in people's thinking after they try out a new behavior. They try something. They try to make movement. It doesn't work out. They learn something. They go back. Sometimes it's always a series of shifts of people making forward movement, and then there's pauses and stops and rewinds and then more progress. And it's not just clients that make these shifts. And what we're going to see on these slides is that as Elizabeth was starting to make shifts in her own thinking, her own view of herself, that, well, so are the workers as well. The case manager, the supervisor, the leaders of the programs, the organization itself was making shifts, and some faster than others. And some shifts were forward and some shifts were backwards. And what I want you to really kind of see through these series as we go forward is starting to also become conscious of your own shifts, whether it's your shifts on a very personal level, whether it's shifts that you start to see on your organization, etc. The importance of keeping us reflective about our practice, and I think that's one of the greatest things that we can do in terms of learning about recovery, is getting in there and experiencing recovery, and being honest with ourselves about how we view people, how we view ourselves and our role, etc., and then how we communicate with each other. So we look at all these shifts that help create this environment that really helped Elizabeth to make this substantial amount of progress over 5 years. One of those shifts was in the area of hope. And there's a series of messages that go along with this. Now, these things that I'll be showing you are not necessarily actual quotes. Some of them actually are actual quotes, but some of them are paraphrasing of a summarization of kind of like what the kind of thinking was going on for the person or the worker, or the talk that was happening around the organization. And Elizabeth was very common of kind of looking at herself as not being worthy of things. And, this thing about the survival mode, that, this may be the best that I actually have. And that started to shift in terms of a better life as possible, and her own language of talking about things that she wanted, whether it was living on her own or, maybe I wouldn't mind singing in the church choir. I may not mind having a dog. There's something more than just what I have right now. But at the same time, the case manager is also going through shifts. And the case manager was very self-reflective of saying that there was a point when she thought that she wasn't sure if Elizabeth could live on her own. And that really started shifting over time to where I'm nervous about it, but maybe that she can do it. And even the worker, even kind of being honest even now that she's still kind of scared about, or sometimes still comes around doubts about, I hope she's going to make it. I hope that when she comes out of the hospital that this isn't going to be the end of it. So sometimes there's always this feeling that sometimes for a lot of people that recovery can be fragile. But I think the most important thing about the shift for the case manager is that even in spite of feeling that things are messy, chaotic, and even being nervous, that there's still this belief that maybe she can do it. There was also a big shift from the organizational level. That was a lot of messages that would go down to staff and sometimes then eventually communicated to clients, is that we have to be very careful about getting people excited about things that may possibly be unrealistic. It's that safety kind of approach that it's great to have people, wanting to move forward in recovery, but let's be careful about igniting dreams that we're not sure if they can achieve or not. Getting people to talk about work, getting people to talk about going back to school. And that creates sometimes a lot of nervousness within programs or even with workers. And clients themselves can be very fearful about these same things, and they pick up on the messages from the workers and also the organization. And this was an organization that definitely was not very risk tolerant, risk averse, that taking risks is a liability, so be careful what goals that you put on treatment plans. But we started to really to see that shift over time, and I think a lot of it came down from the executive director, who made a statement that if people don't dream and take risks, there's no way that we're going to help them recover. If all the goals are safe, then that's really what we have, is a bunch of people who are safe. And what that director talked about a lot was that sometimes that I feel that we do services that make us feel more comfortable rather than clients. But there was more than just hope. You know, it's great to have hope, but it's really the whole thing about having a goal. You know, having a goal is taking that hope and then trying to realize it. And the same thing with Elizabeth. You know, in that survival type mode, a message for her was that I'm just trying to cope, you know, and that even when she thought about possible goals that she wanted to do, she really saw that other people were getting in the way. The barrier was always others and not necessarily herself. And that started to shift in terms of she started naming goals. And I think that's a very powerful thing for people to be able to do in terms of recovery, is to name things. You know, I want my own place. I want to go back to school. I want to get into a relationship. I want to exercise. You know, naming those things, and not only be able to name those, but also to be able to put the active ingredients underneath that, the reasons why. You know, and for Elizabeth, it was, I want to prove to myself and others I can do this. So there's more than just having a place. It's what that meant. But for the shift in terms of the goal for the workers, there was always this kind of conditional response. And we see that a lot of times when people are really nervous about people starting off this recovery journey, especially if they've experienced a lot of time either in the hospital or within the mental health system in formal structured services. And the message often is that, you know, let's get you stable first, and then we can try working on this meaningful and important goal. And that always has the consequence of sometimes diminishing hope. But really the switch for the case manager is not necessarily knowing how to achieve the goal, but recognizing the meaning and importance behind it. And for somebody like Elizabeth, she wasn't even sure about how she could live on her own. In fact, for her and both of her family, the thinking is that, well, the last time it was tried, it just didn't work. And I think that was really easy for the workers sometimes to say, you know, let's make sure that all the things are in place before we even try that again. But the work had really started to shift to, I'm not sure what it's going to take, but if it's important to you, I'll help you explore it. And that's not to say that the case manager could guarantee it and say, you know what, I know that if you try this, it's going to happen. You know, I'm going to make sure that you succeed in this. It's sometimes this also a fragile state, is that I'm not really sure. But the important thing is getting people in motion, getting people moving. And that was a very important part for Renette, the case manager's work with Elizabeth. But the CMHC really creates a context around this. You know, in terms of goals and the way that internal, you know, quality assurance people looked at goals in the organization was, you know, just make sure that every goal meets the criteria of medical necessity. So that whole thing about risk avoidance, or at least let's make sure that auditors recognize it. You know, so that's we write goals sometimes for the purpose of an outside entity knowing what it means. And then the shift to is that, you know, well, yes, it's important for goals to meet the criteria for medical necessity, but let's make sure that, first of all, that clients recognize the goals that are on the treatment plan, that it's recognizable, it's relevant, it's meaningful. And then once we have established that, then let's make sure that your role in that meets the criteria for medical necessity. So basically, make sure the person recognizes it, and then make sure that auditors know why you're involved in that particular goal. And these were big shifts over time. Some other shifts that were occurring that helped create this environment for Elizabeth was around the area of identity and focus. And for a lot of people, I think, with you know, that are kind of in that those you know, stages of, I guess you could call it a stage of recovery, or just that point in their life when things are overwhelming. And a lot of times the identity starts to shift inward to that I'm mentally ill. And, you know, that's really kind of a place for people where they can get very stagnated because it becomes something that starts to block their own ability to move forward in their lives. Even if everybody else was supportive of a meaningful and important goal, there's those barriers of the person saying that I can't do it, I have a permanent disability, I can't work, or I can't go back to school. But that really started to shift for Elizabeth, and once again, these shifts occur over time. So it wasn't that in 2010 that was the message, and then just one day at the beginning of 2011 the narrative switches. These are things that constantly shift over time. And even, what a person who knew Elizabeth or knows Elizabeth even now would recognize that sometimes the temptation to go back to that earlier message is that, I failed again, I went back in the hospital, it's because I'm mentally ill. But really starting to think about herself as a singer, a friend, a daughter, this person who goes to church. So she's a part of something bigger, her faith community. But that she also does struggle at times with distressing thoughts, difficulties with mood, difficulty with depression, feelings of anxiety that sometimes can be extremely disabling. But it really wasn't even just Elizabeth that held this kind of view. It's the case manager's shift was from she's mentally ill. So in some ways, in a sense, placing the same kind of barrier that, the reason that we're not doing this is because, well, there's a lot of things about illness that we need to work on first. So her shift was basically the same thing. We're going to show you a strengths assessment a little bit later on of where you start to see that identity and focus starting coming out, that even Elizabeth and the worker both can see that she's more than just a mental illness. Any mental health center, is going to say that, part of their mission is to serve people with severe and persistent mental illness, or however you define the population that you're serving. But an important shift for this organization is that, we help people with mental illness build and rebuild lives. And I think that's a key shift. Because it's not just an internal focus about helping people learn coping skills and learn to recognize triggers and how to do these things around mental illness, managing symptoms, but it's really how do we help people build lives and outside of our formal systems of care. So as we started seeing these shifts, these also helped create the environment. Some other things is around the use of strengths, and of course we call this the strengths model, but it's not just really about thinking positively about people, it's really helping people to identify very highly specific and tangible strengths that are usable for people to make forward progress in their lives, to achieve meaningful and important goals, to overcome barriers that we call like deficits or challenges, etc., that get in the way of people being able to achieve goals. Well, Elizabeth was kind of in that rut in 2010 of just being a passive recipient of services. So, she goes to her therapist, she goes to meet with her psychiatrist, she goes to her appointments with her case manager, she takes her medication, she goes in the hospital, she receives care, things are done during crisis services. And this really big shift of building on strengths is that seeing ways that she brings things into her own health and wellness, that she's an active participant and she doesn't necessarily have to wait for some magic bullet to make mental illness disappear, but it's like, how do I use things that I have competencies or skills in my own life to help navigate my own environments? And the case manager making a shift from initially being more of a caretaker, a caregiver who, I work with a lot of people who have, definitely multiple challenges in their life and a responsibility to care for people, and then shifting that to be more of a creative skilled professional, an opportunity creator, so that meeting with people, may involve some aspect of caretaking, but more importantly, it's the creative energy of starting to figure out how do I help make, what can I do to help create an environment where this person may take a step in their own recovery, not knowing if I'll ever find it or not. This constant attention to not only finding what's meaningful and important in people, but how to find out these highly usable strengths to organize in such a way that they can begin to have movement in their life. The CMHC in another shift is of starting with of making sure that deficits are documented. And once again, this is not a bad thing. That helps us establish medical necessity, that the precious resources that we have in mental health are targeted towards people who qualify and actually need these services. But a message that started kind of going down through the organization over time is that not only do we need to ensure that we're documenting barriers, that we have a need to be involved in this person's life, but let's start putting equal attention onto the fact of the interventions that we're doing and making sure that they're effective, they're working, and that they're built around people's strengths. You know, not just in a sense trying to overcome deficits, but how to help people build. But there were other shifts that occurred, and the ones that I'm going to go through right now were not necessary. I'm not going to put them into where they occurred for, you know, Elizabeth, the case manager and the worker, but these were also some very important shifts. And some of these were shared decision making. And when I talk about these shifts, we're taking this through the story of Elizabeth. They have lots of application to any person that we work with. You know, for Elizabeth, there was this feeling of not having any control over the medications and the care that she received. And in fact, her only mechanism for trying to regain control was anger. And of course, what that usually typically did was caused her to lose control, because she would often, it was a sign that she wasn't doing well, she'd get hospitalized, etc., or at least, if anything, you know, told to calm down, or in a sense, you know, of a detachment sometimes from others. But really starting to see that she did have some control, that she was the expert of her own experiences, that of what works and what doesn't. And I think, you know, for her, even in the example of her having that apartment, it was, you know, not always looking at it as a failure, but in terms of, you know, that 5-month thing, I started learning more about what worked and what didn't. Medications were a big thing. You know, people that recover, it doesn't mean that they have to use medications or that they need to be off medications, but the more important thing is about how they use medications and how they see the role. And for Elizabeth, there was a rejection of medication and their side effects. And in fact, the only way usually to get her to take her medication was through some involuntary means. You know, court orders, outpatient court orders were put in place often, or they were made conditional sometimes to other things that she would do. To coming to the point of finding a role for medication and deciding how much was she willing to tolerate certain symptoms that she experienced or side effects, you know. And she came to the point to where that she could tolerate a little bit of weight gain. She was willing to tolerate a little bit of uncertainty, anxiety, you know, to not completely dampen out the voices, but rather work to try to recognize them and manage them differently. And I think this tolerance also includes workers as well as clients. You know, what are our levels of tolerance for symptoms and side effects? And I think this was a big shift for not only the case manager, the therapist, but also even the psychiatrist, to not, in a sense, be too frightened that even that she experienced symptoms, that was still fine to actually experience symptoms. The important thing was, how were symptoms evaluated in light of her being able to achieve her goal? And a last one that we'll spend a lot more time in over future sessions is looking at anchors. When we think about people being able to move beyond the system, it's important for us to think about where people are anchored. And if you look at Elizabeth's life in 2010, most of her anchors were right there inside the mental health system. Her social anchors, her leisure anchors, her health anchors. She, you know, her house was in the community, of course, but it was still anchored within the environment that was controlled by her mother and her stepfather. And this really started to change in that by 2015, most of the anchors that she had were in the community. And it's an important, I think, part of strengths model practice of starting to think about how do we help people shift anchors? Because if all of your anchors are inside the mental health system, once there's a problem that goes on, where do people turn? And they'll turn back into where their anchors are lodged. So where do these shifts need to occur to help advance recovery? And you know, as you're kind of seeing on this, is that these shifts are very complex. And you know, you can have a worker who's very much invested in recovery and believes it, but if But if people receiving services don't make these shifts, it lowers the likelihood that recovery is going to occur. And the same thing when you get clients that somehow start to see a future, but that can be dampened by a direct service worker who hasn't made a shift, or supervisors who haven't made shift, or going all the way up to policy and funding levels that may start to dictate how services are delivered. So we can all see this over time. You know, I've been doing mental health practice going all the way back to the mid-1980s, and I've seen a lot of recovery stories where people have heroically recovered despite really any systematic shifts. But if we really want to start to get an environment where we stop just using the word recovery and instead start to think about how do we systematically create these environments, then we need to think about how do we get all these shifts to kind of align towards recovery. So I've thrown a lot of stuff at you. Hopefully some of you at least are still smiling and nodding your heads. But what I'd love to hear from you all is just what shifts have you all experienced? And how have you seen these shifts benefit clients? And so you could talk about this from a personal level, you know, where you've just seen yourselves made your own shifts over the years in terms of how you've looked at recovery or clients, and maybe even how organizations have shifted. So I really want to kind of, you know, what's been happening that you've seen that's kind of really made you kind of excited about the shifts that you've seen over the last few years. And so I'll open that just to anyone that wants to talk about it.
And I invite folks to either chat in your response to Rick's question or raise your hand, and we will take you off of mute so you can pose, you know, tell us about your experience. Okay, it looks like we might have one. So Hector Ramirez says, I have made a shift from letting go of what I had and focus on what I could now have. So Hector, I will take you off of mute, and then it's up to you if you want to go ahead and talk a little bit more about that. Hector, you're good?
Yes, I love this presentation. I think I kind of relate to the last part where they were talking about anchors, life anchors, and I think that really is bringing a lot of this into perspective. I think that having gotten sick and changing into this new person that I am was a transformative process in itself, that I had to kind of stop looking at how I used to do things before in my life or what I had before I got sick. And it wasn't until I kind of learned with accepting who I was now and kind of focusing on the things that I could rather accomplish from then on. And really, I don't know, it really shifted the focus. It was a change, I think, in perspective. That's at least a shift that was very important for me. I didn't kind of continue battling to achieve or get back to things that I had lost, but just kind of really shifted a whole new direction. I had to really find new opportunities.
Beautiful. Thanks so much for sharing, Hector.
And Gloria Frederica from San Francisco.
Hi, Karen. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. There's a bit of interference, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to speak to the importance of even making small shifts organizationally, always talking about successes when we're talking about people in the different assigning cases, presenting on new assessments. It's so, you know, it was really hard at first, but you know, it was hard for our therapists to get used to doing it, but once they did, it really began to change the culture, that to begin to look at the people who we were working with, often for many years, as being really having, you know, actually having hope that people can recover, and actually talking about successes, because we forget that as therapists, you know, often we get really, you know, burnt out and sort of have lost our own hope. So, you know, just, you know, remembering to ask about successes in staff meetings and things like that has really made a difference.
Very nice. Thanks, Gloria.
And Estrella Espinoza, I'm going to take you off of mute now. You've shared quite a bit on the in the questions, so I'd love you to describe your story. Okay, Estrella, can you may not be able to speak through your computer, so Estrella, if you don't mind, I will share what you have typed, and then if you're able to speak up, interrupt me. She says, at the personal level, I have evolved to the point that I'm fearless, and I bring to managers real issues that get in the way of providing better service. And I think she had one more comment. At the organizational level, I was lucky to get, as a supervisor, a woman who cares about bringing change and follows through with what is needed to bring change to the system of care. Estrella, ask one more time. Can we hear you? Okay, so we may just have a little bit of a technical snafu, but Rick, any comments while I move on?
No, I think that's absolutely you know, beautiful, and people are very fortunate when they're in organizations that you know, I mean, the easy part is embracing the word recovery, but they're actually willing to you know, put themselves out there and make mistakes to try to make change. And you know, it's you know, when I was a case manager, I always kind of felt really powerless. You know, like how can I make a system change? And you know, for me, I think it was the shifting of realizing that even as a case manager with no organizational power, that I still had tons of power, and how I impacted other people that I work with. So, you know, what's nice is that, you know, when you have those personal shifts and then you see that the organization is also shifting at the same time, to really allow that kind of thinking to impact the rest of the people on your team and your organization, and that gets really exciting. So.
Great, and Laura Lambright, you indicated you have something to share. I've taken you off mute.
I see that, thank you. I'm a recovered client. I've been working for the county for, it's going to be 17 years this coming July. What the first thing that got me stable is my medication. What really helps is this job, giving myself perks after my bills are paid, and the support of friends and being part of a organization that helps people so I can spread hope and share my success.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. And how about Jorge Romero? I'm just about to take you off mute, so I'll let you know. I've got to find you in the list. Okay, Jorge, can you hear us? Can we hear you?
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, what I see as I guess an encouraging story is also the idea that we're utilizing more strength-based ideas and focusing on people's strengths and even agents' strengths instead of you know, what we don't have. So what we have instead of what we don't. That is a shift, I believe, in mentality a lot of us working in this field and also dealing with our clients.
Great, and for those that may not have heard Jorge well, he said, I'm seeing the idea of utilizing strengths on our clients and on our agencies instead of focusing on what we don't have, and I think he was describing that. Rick, why don't we take one or two more?
Okay, sounds perfect.
Tom Orrick, you indicated you've got a personal experience you'd like to share. And I know he's connected by computer, and sometimes computers don't have microphones to be heard. So what Tom has shared in his question is, as the parent of a teenager who struggles with depression, I am in recovery from the need to control all the pieces. I'm learning to listen to his input and about his own needs. And
nice.
let me just, I think we have a couple more here. Jamie Garcia, I will take you off of mute and we'll make you our last respondent for the moment. Jamie, can we hear you? Okay, let me, she sent a couple of messages, so let me share those. In shifts, she said the county system actively seeks out persons with lived experience for employment and volunteerism. She notes that as one shift. And then she said, I learned to better trust that I am the right person for management and self-doubt is receding. I stick to my work, and references RAP. And I think that was it. And sorry, Jamie, that we weren't able to hear from you, but appreciate your sharing. And it looks like there's a few more coming in, but we'll have some more time to check in with folks and share this. But we do want to move on so we cover all of our material. So Rick, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. You know, one thing, you know, this particular session in the webinar series, it was designed to introduce you to multiple concepts, to dip into a story. But I want you to see is that as we go through additional sessions, we're going to continue to keep going down to a more of a micro level about, you know, how do workers start to help make these things happen. And, you know, I just wanted to give you a little preview as that if we're going to start moving into other sessions of actually looking at the strengths assessment, you're going to get to see a lot of practices and tools that make this. But this is really important, I think, for those of you in terms of your desire to keep going along with this this webinar series, is that are these concepts exciting to you? You know, so this first one is that you're really being introduced is this whole concept of shifts, and more operationally we'll be talking about how shifts happen. But we're going to kind of go into a little bit from shifts to also talking a little bit about messages and behaviors. And you know, the last caller had mentioned the fact that the organization you know, actively recruits and hires people with lived experience of mental illness, and that's a behavior that communicates a message. You know, I worked in a system that you know, just refused to hire at one point people that have the lived experience, and so the only way you could get a job, you know, even for myself, was that you had to hide the fact that you had any lived experience of mental illness or family. And so anytime behaviors happen, they communicate messages. And you know, there's very rare that you can have an organization that says that, you know, we don't believe that people with a lived experience are competent enough to be practitioners, or we don't have these explicit signs that say that, you know, chances of recovery here are extremely low, or even you personally, we have strong doubts that you will be able to recover. You know, we don't believe that people can go to work. But, you know, even if I go through my own experiences in my own organizations, you know, there was very strong messages about, you know, can people work? Can they live on their own? Can they go back to school, etc. And the important thing, I think, to start thinking about is that, you know, no matter what we think we say, or, you know, everything that we do communicates a very explicit message. And that's where we're going to kind of take this on a little bit, because when we think about power, you know, a power of a worker, the behaviors that we do is very much an exercise of power, because it does communicate a very explicit message that for lots of people, if, you know, for most people that I know that have made strides in their own recovery, they will be able to point back to things that people did, you know, not just what they said, but what people actually did. And those messages communicated a lot of things about hope, about taking risk, about you know, learning to manage struggles, all of those things. You know, what's difficult is that, you know, at times that our behaviors can even contradict these things that we put on the walls, you know, and for clients that, you know, can go into a waiting room and they can see all these messages of recovery, and then experience within the system that, you know, there's behaviors that actually sometimes are not really conveying the message of recovery, and sometimes maybe being antithetical to recovery. And just like with anything that we do, that there can be this substantial disparity between what we believe we do and then what we actually do. And then I've experienced that as a practitioner as well. You know, philosophically, I believe certain things about people, and then being called out by a client that you know, kind of called me on my message. And I think that's very important for us all if we're thinking about making these shifts and stuff, is that sometimes it's when we leave ourselves vulnerable and being open to the fact that sometimes what we do and what we say are not always the same thing. And I think that often we underestimate the power of messages within every single encounter. You know, I always like us to not think about that we're working with a caseload, which sounds terrible to me, that, or even that we're even working with a particular client. But thinking about is that, you know, when I'm getting ready to go out and meet with somebody, of kind of being conscious of the power that I kind of wield, that I have an opportunity sometimes to help create an environment, that I have the opportunity sometimes to infuse hope. I have the opportunity to communicate a message to someone. And those messages communicate what we believe about recovery. And I think the way that, you know, when people learn about recovery, they learn it from people's actions. And, you know, there's lots of people with lived experience that learn about recovery from other people with a lived experience, because the behaviors are the fact that, wow, you hear voices, but you're going to work. And how do you do that? So it's nice, once again, with the alignment, we just don't want people with the lived experience aligning around those messages. We want workers and organizations to also be able to do that. So I'm gonna call out myself for a little bit, and you know, I actually sat for a little bit and thought about, you know, what are things that I've actually said over my course as a practitioner, and the inadvertent message, you know, and just give a little bit of history about myself. I mean, I was raised in the mental health system in a lot of ways, you know, from family experience, my own personal experience, etc. And you know, when I finally, found some way to get through my bachelor's degree in college and got my first mental health job after 3 attempts, because, you know, people don't like to hire people if you've had a certain kind of history. You know, I really thought that, you know, okay, well, I understand people with the lived experience, so obviously I'm going to be this great practitioner, and I understand about people's strengths, and I believe in people. But even despite those things, is that you find that you do inadvertent messages. And so these are things that, you know, I've said before, and you may have said these things and it didn't have the same message, you know. But we also have to realize is that there's times that we say things that we do intend a subtle message, and there's times that we just don't realize what that message is going to do, but people do pick up on it sometimes and misinterpret it, which can be just as damaging. You know, I remember sometimes even being in a team meeting and being frustrated with a person and just saying, I don't know. The person just seems unmotivated, and really my message really is that, you know, I've done all I can do, and the main problem is the client and his unwillingness to do anything to help himself. So, you know, I may not have said that, but really that's kind of what I communicated. You know, I've even used the word before about low-functioning people on my caseload, and you know, now for me is that I abhor that word, and I can't stand when people use it, because what I find is that you know, we're all sometimes low-functioning, high-functioning in different areas, and it's sometimes not really a matter of that. I mean, I've worked with people before that you know, couldn't have went out and you know, had a conversation with somebody without it being completely word salad, and they've been labeled as low functioning, and at the same time they knew more about baseball than any person I've ever known. So is that high functioning or not? But when I say that, basically what I'm kind of communicating is that, you know what, I have very low expectations for several people on my caseload. Sometimes that's, when we use that language, we're already kind of, you know, laying out our hand about, you know, I don't really necessarily expect a lot of these people to go to work. You know, another one is that I always hate this one too. My wife sometimes has asked me this question, you know, hey, Rick, did you take your meds? And but I've said it before to people. And in some ways is that, you know, my inadvertent message is that, you know, well, if you say no, well, then no wonder things are going poorly. But at the same time is that if you say yes, well, then, you know, well, you're probably not telling me the truth. You're not telling me the whole story. You know, it's the same thing as that, you know, you've been drinking. So sometimes there's these messages, you know, or sometimes, being in a person where they're expressing an intense emotion and telling someone, I've done this before, where, you know, being angry about it isn't going to help, you know. And really what I'm kind of saying on that is that, you know, I really don't feel comfortable when you express any intense emotion. So, you know, that's what you communicate sometimes. Or, you know, I've even said before, you know, that maybe we should focus on something else right now. And really what I was communicating was, you know, I'm not really sure that you can achieve this goal. and I really don't have the energy to help you with something that I don't think is achievable. So I'm just telling on myself on these. I'm sure that I've done a lot of things over the years that have been spirit-breaking. You know, the point here is that not even to ask you all just to say, you know, what are horrible things that you've said, but you know, the important thing is about being human is to just recognize that anything that you say, whether intended or not, does have a message that's associated with it, whether it's what you intend or it's what the person interprets it. And so that goes back to that whole thing about this single encounter being so powerful. And it's why I love this type of work. You know, it's because there's just, for me, there's just nothing more satisfying than engaging with another human being and walking a journey with them. It's a very powerful thing, and it's a privilege. So here's a few things some behaviors that do align with recovery. Things that hopefully that I've learned to do over the years, but I'm going to bring us back to the story of Elizabeth. And these are some behaviors that happened. You know, one of those things is just being in the presence of people. You know, there's times that sometimes that we don't really know exactly what to do or what to say. And, you know, people with lived experience can forgive a lot of those things, but what they pick up on more thing is about that sincere presence. And it covers a lot of mistakes that we make. And, you know, for a lot of people that they expect that, you know, when things are messy and chaotic that you're going to back away from them. And that's a powerful behavior that aligns recovery because it communicates hope, it communicates belief. It also communicates the fact that you don't need to be perfect to be in a working relationship with me. You know, another one is taking the time to just find out what's meaningful and important to people. It's, you know, whenever I've sometimes seen aha moments with people, it's been when you finally get them talking about something that their eyes light up, and you know, it's, and it starts to kind of crank things in people's minds. And an example with Elizabeth is that, you know, even though in the very beginning she wasn't even sure that she could live on her own, just the fact that we spent time talking about it, you could see in her eyes that she wanted it. And it was a powerful moment of being able to talk about it, even in the presence of concerns. You know, another one is not discounting people when they finally share a goal with you. And for lots of people with lived experience, especially people that have had lots of losses in their life, finally sharing with you something very intimate about what they want to life is a very vulnerable kind of thing. And sometimes even in our own discomfort of acknowledging it and being willing to explore it, even if you don't know how it's going to turn out. And I know for me, one of those moments was a person that I was working with that said he wanted to be an airline pilot. You know, the first reaction inside of me was that, oh my goodness, yeah, first, that's frightening to me. You know, I didn't say that verbally, but there really was this thing is that, you know, this person had been homeless for multiple years in their life, and now they're going to fly a plane. You know, but the thing is that I held in there, not because I was smart, because more I just didn't know exactly what to do. But eventually this guy, of hanging in there with him and helping him explore it and look at different things, he eventually became a baggage handler out at the airport. And that was a goal that eventually became very meaningful and established an anchor that was outside the mental health system. So sometimes when people share a goal, you don't really know where it's going to lead. And I think the same thing with like Elizabeth. You know, sometimes it's a matter of getting something in motion. You know, all the focus with Elizabeth originally came around just helping her get her apartment. And, you know, it wasn't the easiest goal for her to attain in that beginning because even she had reservations, but it unlocked so many other things that weren't named. By the fact that she had accomplished that, it put in belief about being able to sing in a church choir, to eventually getting a dog, to putting herself on the line and trying to develop a relationship with the elderly woman that lived right across from her. Some other ones on that is just taking the time to organize strengths, and that's what you're going to see when we show Elizabeth's strengths assessment, is that just taking the time to organize these things helps us to start thinking about that, you know, that, well, maybe this person does believe it. You know, there's things like walking alongside people, being transparent about what we do so that we're not working and then going and writing a chart, but they're actually talking about, you know, hey, I'm doing the strengths assessment. This is why I'm doing it. This is why I'm asking you these questions. I don't want to spend a lot of time in this because I know a lot of you already know what recovery is, and that's probably, why you even decided to start this webinar is because, hey, it's recovery, I recognize that. But I just wanted to put up a few quick definitions, and, probably I'll always say my favorite's going to be my own, and that middle one is that recovery being this life worth living that's beyond the mental health system. And I can't remember the very first caller that was talking about that whole concept of anchors for him. It's this whole thing about that my identity is not as a client, but my identity is now as something that I'm part of the community and has meaning and purpose. So recovery ultimately means is that we're thinking beyond stabilization, and recovery can be a part of stabilization, but it's really about thinking about, how do we help people move beyond that? And honestly, we've historically underestimated people's ability to thrive outside of our systems of care, and that's been very limiting. And even though we've sometimes constrained people, people still find ways to go beyond our expectations, and we always see that. There's lots of reasons we should invest in recovery. I always look at it as that it's untapped human potential. There's not a person who can't make an important contribution into their community or the life of others. And really the effectiveness of what we do is very much intricately related about what we do with people. I think that the fact that we can help people get jobs and go back to school and rebuild these lives, that tells me more about are we really being effective in our work. And honestly, that the cost of not working on recovery is extremely high. If we want a business case for recovery, when I think about someone who is not working on goals that they find meaningful and passionate about, if you don't have that within you, you're very high risk of suicide, very high morbidity, mortality, where people kind of start to resign themselves to the mental health system. So human cost is very high, and there's systems cost. If you want to talk about working with difficult clients, is working with clients that are not in motion anymore. They've become stagnant in their own lives and they've kind of given up. And that's really where Elizabeth was. And when you think about Elizabeth's cost to the system, it's that she lived in four walls, and basically her intersection with the world was the crisis line, was with the hospital, and that's changed. But these shifts have to be more than philosophical. All these things need to kind of occur on multiple levels. There needs to be actions and behaviors. And, since we're a publicly funded mental health system, it's not just about helping people identify meaningful goals. It's also justifying why a skilled mental health professional needs to be involved in those. So as we kind of go through this series, a common thing that we're going to be talking about putting these pieces together, about doing recovery-oriented work, is really started from the premise of people's meaningful and important goals. Before we even start thinking about deficits, that we're starting to really think about what makes this person tick, what's passionate for them, what is something that's going to help them get out of bed, what's going to be a reason for them to possibly stop using drugs or alcohol, what's going to be the reason not to commit suicide, there's got to be a goal that drives it. It's really hard for anybody to start going in motion if there's not something that's important for them to drive through. But then the important part is that finding a role for mental health professionals. Just because a person expresses a recovery-oriented goal does not mean that we have to have a role in it. I always like to think about, that when a person, says that I'd like to go to work, the first goal doesn't necessarily be is that, well, how do I get myself into that? Or if a person says, I'd like to have a relationship with somebody, and then we insert ourselves into that discussion, a question is there a role for me in here? And in some ways it may be walking alongside of people. In some ways it may be playing a very small role into it. Like the person may be saying that, I don't need you to help me meet people, but I really could use some help in terms of not feeling anxious when I'm talking with people. So maybe there's a small role. So when I think about good work that we do, there's part of it is creating of opportunities, but the other part is removal of barriers to achievement of goals. And I think that's probably the best thing that we can do is help people identify goals and find a role where we help people remove barriers, no matter what that is. And the last part is that we succinctly tie this together through documentation. And a thing that we're going to be looking at through this series over time is that we're actually even going to go inside documentation, so that not only we're talking about how the practices were structured and how they occurred, but then what does it look like on documentation? You know, is it a storyline that doesn't just tell a storyline of medical necessity, but it also builds a storyline of hope and purpose, purposeful and effective interventions? So in other words, client's goal, medical necessity, provider interventions, and the documentation. These are the pieces that you're going to see as we go through a lot of these different stories. I'm going to switch that one. Let me just kind of go to questions for right now. I know that probably that last part felt like it was kind of jumbled and thrown together. But before we kind of go on and we're going to step back outside of Elizabeth's story and look at the organization as a whole, I want to stop and see if you just had any questions or anything that we've mentioned that kind of has got you thinking or...
Rick, there was a question, and I think it sets the stage for our next section, but Daniil Zavala, I just took you off mute. Would you like to pose your question?
Sure, thank you. This MHA. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so my question was, you know, I feel a recovery-oriented culture is essential to good client care, especially in California, where the Mental Health Services Act requires us to integrate the recovery model into all MHSA-funded programs and services. However, the level of professional burnout and resulting cynicism and turnover amongst mental health professionals, especially in the public mental health system, can create ongoing barriers to truly embracing a recovery culture. So my question was, in what ways can organizations better support their clinicians and other staff to create an environment that really values recovery and demonstrates that the organization is willing to do what it takes to make recovery a part of their agency policies and day-to-day practices? Because I think that people know the information, but you know, the real barriers that the staff are experiencing are making it very difficult. And I think also, sorry, I'm kind of adding on here, you know, the fact that we don't usually, or we haven't determined a way to consistently measure recovery outcomes is also problematic, because we know that people conform their behavior often, especially in the workplace, to what is actually measured. So those are my questions for you.
Right. You're spot on with what you're saying. It's kind of beautiful, because the number one training that we get asked to do from us here at the Center for Mental Health Research and Innovation is burnout. That's the number one requested training from organizations, and it's the one training that we actually refuse to do, because for me it's like burnout is a product of so many complex things. And you know, usually, you know, to me that you know, how you reduce burnout is that that you make your work very clear and purposeful. Doesn't necessarily mean that you make it easier, but you make it very purposeful. You know, I know that when I took over the very first organization that I became an executive director for, you know, the first thing that I actually did was actually pull together an entire focus group of clients. And I didn't ask them, how do we make this agency better? I mean, it was a horrible agency in terms of, you know, talk about measuring. I mean, outcomes, you know, we measured hospitalization. Hospitalizations were high. We measured employment. They were extremely low. Nobody went back to school. High rates of drug and alcohol abuse. High rates of just lots of stuff. Anyway, but you know, it was really asking people, you know, like, what do they want for their lives? And that was kind of like the first operationalization of recovery. You know, people, when they started talking about what they really want in their lives, it was like any other person that lived in the county. It was completely absence of mental illness. It was just normal lives and dreams. You know, so in terms of when we started going to staff, it was about, you know, we need to create a system that helps people achieve these things. You know, so that's where, you know, sometimes measurements, I like to look at them more as indicators of that, you know, what would we be doing as an organization what would be the indicators that tell us is that we're even moving in the right direction? And that for me, when you start hearing about recovery stories, you hear about things like, you know, a way to generate an income, you know, so people going back to work, even though that doesn't mean that everybody's going to go back to work, but you should see a substantial number of people going back to work. You know, when you think about 60 to 70% of people with serious mental illness desire employment, or people going back to school, or people doing more things that their social anchors are more in the community than they are in the mental health center. Even lowering hospitalization is fine, because that tells you that, you know, people aren't going to the hospital to get their needs met, that they're actually finding ways to thrive outside of the hospital. But the thing from staff is that it's making the expectations very clear about what we do here, and then removing the organizational barriers for people actually doing that. And I know that's a really hard thing, but, you know, when we actually go into organizations with the strengths model, we talk about how do we get rid of paperwork that's completely meaningless, that doesn't contribute to people getting jobs and getting people going back to school? How do we reduce meetings where all we talk about is things that don't relate to those things? You know, that we spend a half an hour talking about, you know, how one person, you know, relapsed on drugs and alcohol. That, you know, it's really about becoming very intentional. Now, I know that's a long way of answering your question, and I hope that we're going to, through this series, of start really breaking those things down. But from an organizational level, if you want to stop, if you really want to stop people from leaving the organizations, find out about what makes staff tick, what gets them excited, because they're the ones who are going to have to be out there getting people excited about moving forward with their recovery. If you have people that are burnt out, then none of us are going anywhere.
Rick, there's a couple other questions that have come in, but I want to give Vince Ramos an opportunity to share his questions or thoughts.
Sure.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, Rick, I how can I say this? I've seen your system work pretty well in our mental health department, and I find that we have a wellness center here where clients that have recovered or working on recovery have helped others toward that goal of being independent. But sometimes it's the direction from the director or whoever in lead of the mental health system that sort of stagnates this. 2009, we had a wellness center that was taking in community people that could come in and talk about their problems, and then they would leave, and they would get their help and get encouraged and stuff like that by the staff. But then after 2009, they shut the doors on that and wouldn't allow people that were in recovery to help other people, and you had to have a SMI or severe mental illness to go into that. And now we have a new director which is opening the door again to help other people with with severe mental illness by people that have had a mental illness. But I believe that, like as you say, that it's administration that sort of helps in burnout, because sometimes the practitioner knows what's needed, but because of liability, as you said, interferes, and they say, oh, you can't do that because if something happens, we can get sued or something. And so I believe that administration has a big part in recovery. So my question would be, how do you direct administration to see this and improve the life of the client?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer, and probably not with the time and what we've got to go, but I'd like to keep trying to come back to that type of question. You know, one of those things I think is that, you know, sometimes we just need movement. You use the word stagnation, and that's probably the big killer of an organization, is that we get to the point that we get kind of tired and we stop change. So sometimes we sprinkle words around things, but our behaviors become stagnant and they become persevering. And I think one of the things that I think that leadership can do is that, you know, is getting to how do we move towards a learning, growing organization. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen, but there's lots of them that I see out there, you know. So I don't know the answers of how you make it happen. What I typically see is that sometimes people don't see the light, but they feel the heat. What I always like to think about is that if you want change, then sometimes you have to incentivize the change.
Well, Rick, I think this is a good stage to move into our slides. We've got just 15 minutes, and I think you've got a great story to tell how one organization began to do this. But also, you know, we understand your questions, and as we build in the remaining webinar sessions, we will, you know, continue to hit that issue hard about organizations and leadership, administration, et cetera.
Well, thank you. I mean, I always hate this because these are beautiful conversations to have, and time constraints are not my forte. But let's move forward on here. This is the organization that was you know, the context of Elizabeth's recovery journey, and it was the one the worker was in. And you know, I'm not saying that they were a very bad organization, but if you talk about measurements, they didn't necessarily have, you know, some of the most impressive outcomes within the state. But they made this decision on an organization to implement the strengths model of case management, and they didn't even really, I think, know exactly why they wanted to do it. They just wanted to do it. So all people have received the basic strengths model training, which, you know, that doesn't necessarily change the systems. You know, it just gives people training. But the biggest thing in terms of a learning organization is that, you know, right after the training, we had all case managers go out and just practice using the strengths assessment, which is one client. You know, that's, you know, we need to give each other time to learn, and if we want to start to change things, we have to do it sometimes at a very small level. You know, you can't just say, okay, we're going to do strengths assessments now, by next week everybody has to have a strengths assessment. Let's learn how to do it. Let's learn how to interact with people. You know, and one of the things after all these case managers went out there is that, you know, it went reasonably well with 5 out of the first 7. It generated lots of discussion. I mean, that was great to have. It didn't all work perfectly. But it also generated lots of questions because, you know, people started out learning with some of the clients that they thought would be most receptive to it. But one of the questions that came out on that first learning session was, well, okay, that's great. It worked with some of these clients, but how is it going to work with somebody like Elizabeth? So Elizabeth's case manager did a presentation on Elizabeth at group supervision. You're going to learn more about group supervision as we go later on. And Elizabeth's case manager was a very good practitioner. She believed in recovery, you know, all these things. She was still new, but she also was at least open enough to say that she was feeling frustrated with Elizabeth, that, you know, hey, she'd heard that she wanted to live on her own, but she didn't think she was ready, and the parents didn't. So into this whole thing is that, you know, I was actually out there at that meeting, and it was like, you know, well, why don't we just go out and talk to Elizabeth? Let's introduce this concept of recovery. That was our goal going out there, and let's do a strengths assessment. So I think all of you should have a copy of Elizabeth's strengths assessment. And I want you just to take like just a minute or two just to look at this. And this was kind of a product of a few sessions, maybe 3 or 4 times of meeting with Elizabeth, that finally some of this started to develop. But, you know, if you go back and remember that story of Elizabeth and her narrative about I'm mentally ill, the fact that, you know, her anchors were all inside of her, the formal systems of care, the fact that she had 7 hospitalizations in 2009, and then the way she viewed herself and the worker, and then look at this strengths assessment and see if this kind of changes how you look at Elizabeth. For those of you who don't have in front of them, there's actually 2 parts to this, or a front and a back. Unfortunately, I'm going to probably end up failing you in terms of time. But what I want to let you know, I was going to spend some time actually letting you kind of comment on this and what you saw, but our whole next session that we do is going to be devoted just to this strengths assessment. Well, not particularly Elizabeth's strengths assessment, but we're going to go through another storyline, and we're going to learn a little bit more about how these strengths assessments are conducted. How do we get this information? What's the content? What's the process involved? But one thing I just want to tell you just about this strengths assessment, it was a critical shift again for Elizabeth. And just because these words were written does not mean that once she saw them that automatically she said, wow, you know, I didn't really realize that I had so much going for me. But once again, it was part of a shift of starting to amplify the well aspects of Elizabeth, of making a narrative shift from there's nothing I can do to help myself to maybe that there are things. It also helped the shift in the worker of saying that I don't know how we're going to do it, to starting to see some things in there that, well, maybe she can do it. You know, maybe there's some things in here that actually could help support her to be able to try to venture out and live on her own again. So what I want to do is I want to just show you some elements really about strengths model practice, and this is still at that kind of 50,000 foot view. And I also want to mention that, you know, the strengths model is something that I've been part of developing, but it's only one way of doing recovery-oriented work. It's not that if you don't do the strengths model, you're not doing recovery. You're all doing lots of different aspects of this. But what the strengths model, I think, is it consolidates a lot of that stuff together. So this is not saying you have to go out and implement this, but hopefully it'll give you some ideas about how these things come together. You know, an important part of the strengths model is really about client-centered goal identification and achievement. That's really it. It's not really about just helping people to manage illness. It's really about helping people achieve goals. And if helping people to manage distressing thoughts will remove a barrier to them being able to go back to work, well, then it can become a focus. But everything hinges on that goal achievement. So there's this continual attention to just find out what's meaningful and important to people. So for Elizabeth, you know, there was lots of things that she wanted in her life, but that was the one that really sparked her. So it's kind of like, you know, it doesn't, for me, it's like I have 4 kids, and all I really want to do is see them in motion. They come up with all kinds of goals, but I just need one. I need one that's going to keep people out of inertia. And in the strengths model, that problems and barriers are not ignored, but they're viewed in the context of how they affect goal achievement. So for Elizabeth, you know, that 5 months of not making it in her apartment wasn't viewed as a failure. And there are problems, barriers, but the more important part of it is that it provided a lot of learning. And another part is that Elizabeth had fear about this. And they can be acknowledged. You don't have to say, well, let's just focus on the goal. But let's also focus on the fact that, you know, one of the things that you're worried about living on your own is feeling lonely, or what are you going to do if all of a sudden the voices get really bad, or you start thinking of suicide. So, and our intervention strategy should be relevant to those goals. So, you know, there was a long times, if you looked at her treatment plan, that talked about helping her manage distressing thought, regulating mood, but those things really weren't important to Elizabeth until that goal of the apartment came out. And now all of a sudden it's like, hey, I see some relevancy in helping me be able to better regulate my mood. So that's one part of it. Another one is the identification and use of people's strengths. You know, it's the constant look of that. Things that sometimes were looked as ordinary now become important, like her love of country music, her singing. Those became things that, that helped her. And it's important not only for, you know, a worker to see strengths, but it's more important that Elizabeth sees it, that it's her own narrative shifting. So, you know, one of those things in sometimes what we think is ordinary, the fact that her worker helped her identify country songs, which was one of her things on her strengths, that had strong messages for women. That was a very powerful thing for her, of seeing within her own music there were these signs of hope. And another thing that we'll talk about later is finding the perfect niche. You know, it's not that Elizabeth now can go anywhere in the community and feel completely comfortable, but she's found places where she's competent and she thrives. So, you know, if you saw Elizabeth at some place where she's not comfortable, she doesn't do well. But if she's singing in the church choir, you couldn't look at anybody that looks more healthy. Karen, did you want to say something? Because I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you can wrap this up, we've got to take 5 minutes to just set the stage for the next session.
Okay, then I'll go through these really quick. Goal planning is definitely looked differently in the strengths model, that it's not this big annual event or even quarterly event, but what it happens is that each opportunity is about just taking one step. and that's building confidence. Shared decision-making factors a lot within the strengths model, and we'll see that in future sessions. For Elizabeth, it's like mutual decisions were made before any step was taken. And even if it was just that we decide not to decide anything that day, but it's always in the context of what do we want to do today or next week to help us make a move towards this goal that you're wanting. Contact has to occur in the community. If we talk about that recovery doesn't occur in the mental health center, then it's got to be out there. Helping people to, not only do the interventions in the community, but probably more importantly is that's you learn how to deal with distressing thoughts in your apartment by learning it in your apartment and sometimes even experiencing it in your apartment. I'm going to skip through that, but I do want to come back to I'll do this next time as this more thing about anchors and how her anchors shift, but I think we've already kind of touched a lot on that, but I'm really going to kind of go more into anchors next time. So Karen, I'm going to turn that back over to you and how you want to take it from here with questions in the webinar series.
Okay, well, I'm going to quickly go through some next steps, and then as time allows and as folks want to linger, we'll take questions.
Okay.
But in terms of where we're going from here with the webinar series, next slide. What we're hoping to do is to provide you an opportunity to both as individuals but also organizationally critically reflect on where are you related to recovery-oriented services, and set a goal. Where do you want to be? Where does your organization want to be? Where do you want to be as an individual, as a team? So really encourage as much as you can to work together as a team. If your managers aren't involved and your leadership's not involved, do your best to try to engage them. We hope that this will set the stage for some decisions and some commitments about shaping your program towards recovery, and what next steps do you want to take. And we're going to be talking about how recovery-oriented services can adhere to current documentation standards. They really are not mutually exclusive. They can serve each other. We don't need policy to change in order to do recovery. So as the next series, we'll be talking about amplifying the well aspects of the person. Rick is, I think, giving you a lot of insight into that. We're going to dive deep into how to do that and talk organizationally about how to do that. Similarly with the remaining topics that are listed here. I won't go through them in detail. But I do want to introduce you to a practice orientation scale that we invite you to do. We recognize that you're, as an organization, it's a continuum. It's your own process of going from where you are today to where you want to be as an organization in a parallel process to what you do with clients. So we want that movement to be achieved by linking your client-centered goals in the process of developing those with the provider interventions that get you paid and are medically necessary and that are documented and explained through documentation. So we knit those four pieces together with the client at the center and everything being goal-driven. So we'll be bringing all of that out in the subsequent sessions. We invite you, though, in the meantime, to complete the scale. So there are 5 elements in the scale that's going to be on the next slide. So go ahead, Rick, and put the next one up. We've got 4 levels for each. And what we'd like you to do is be prepared to share your scores as we talk about the individual components in the various webinars. So we'll be talking, it looks like you guys lost me a little bit. Rick, can you take the next slide? Thank you. Gloria, thank you for that heads up. I don't know what happened to my sound, but we recommend that you take some time between now and then this session and score individually your practice and then come together as a team and score your team. and then be prepared to share those scores anonymously during the future webinars because we want to see where folks are. And we're not suggesting that everybody has to get to level A. It's really part of the process that you're going through is to decide where do you want to be as an agency. So that's a recommendation for being prepared to get the most out of this in coming sessions. We're a minute late, so I won't ask for questions, but the next session will be Wednesday, February 3rd, same time, this lunch hour through 1:30. And you'll see that it's the first the first Wednesday of each month for the next 6 months. And Rick, the last slide about the webinar recording. This has been recorded. The recording will be available within 24 hours. We'll send you a link, but it will also within the week be available on the CIBHS YouTube channel. So you'll be able to share this with other folks. And if you have questions, please be sure to add them to your evaluation, which will be as you leave the session. Let us know what else you have questions about so that we know where to put our emphasis and to provide adequate detail and insights. So at this point, I'd like to thank you all for your participation. Sorry to go 2 minutes late. Rick, thank you so much for your presentation, and all of you had questions and feedback. Really appreciate that. A quick shout out to Telecare and the San Francisco system for being some of our early testers of this webinar, and Sharon for supporting the technology and all. Rick, any final thoughts?
No, I enjoyed myself and ready for the next one.
Very good. So looking forward to seeing you all back in about a month. Great afternoon, safe travels in this wet weather. Bye-bye, everyone.